Wow, thank you. That was quite the introduction. Lightning rod, yes, I guess. But I want to start by thanking all of you. I think everybody in this room, for one reason or another, is engaged in the same basic mission, which is to create a flourishing world, a world where women and girls can flourish as equals with boys and men who are flourishing. And that doesn't happen just by itself. It takes work, it takes intention. And you've already mentioned, I think, that I'm inspired a bit by my own work previously at Brookings, but I'm inspired by my work as a father. I'm a boy dad. I have 3 sons of my own, and I'm going to come to them in a moment. But I do just want to start by saying I want to thank you for the work you're doing. And sometimes my goal in an audience is to persuade people that we should take some of the issues that boys and men are facing in society more seriously, in research, in policy, and in our conversations, in a way that in no way takes away from the ongoing work that is still necessary for women and girls. That we need to get past the zero-sum framing that is ruining so much of the current debate about sex and gender in the US, where you're expected to somehow choose sides, as if there are sides here to choose between. It'd be like saying, and the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, said it exactly this way recently. He said, I have a son and a daughter. Of course, I care equally about both of them. We would think it would be crazy to suggest he had to choose between the two. And it's the same in our society as well. But there are so many people on both sides who are trying to play this as a zero-sum game. So that's partly why I ended up here. I will just, one note, thank you for mentioning my narration of the Audible book. I did, in fact, read the book myself, which is harder than you'd think. I didn't think it would be difficult. I mean, I wrote the book and I can read, right? So you'd think it'd be easy. It turns out it's quite difficult. There's someone listening for whether your stomach is grumbling after dinner and stuff like that. But what was really, really difficult about it was I had to audition for the part. They wouldn't just accept me. They said, you have to audition for the part of reading my own book. And I said, well, I could talk about my own upbringing. You know, I mentioned the fact that I was raised in the UK and I'm now a very, very proud US citizen. I mentioned that. I talk about all of that. You know, if I don't get the part, who are you going to use? And they said, some unemployed British actor. So I'd like to apologize to the unemployed British actor, who I did out of a job. But I was pleasantly surprised that when I auditioned for the role of myself, I got the part. It's harder than you think. So yes, any way you read it. Now, I know that there are some folks who are here, and this is summertime. You're not at college, and so I apologize in advance. There's some social science coming. That's kind of who I am. By background, I've worked in government, I've worked in think tanks, I've worked in journalism. I'm a bit of a kind of wonky, scholarly guy, kind of at heart. So I do have charts. My wife would sometimes ask me when I got home, how was your day? And I would say, well, what do you mean? Median, mode? Do you want it on a scale of 1 to 10? And honestly, honey, if you just followed me on social media, you wouldn't have to ask this question all the time. Just follow me on Twitter. Then you'll know how I am, because it saves so much time at the end of every day. So I apologize for that. But let me start by asking this question, which is why? And some of you may be wondering the same thing, but perhaps from a different perspective to some of the people that I very often address. So for example, I've spoken at the UN Women's Summit, the He for She Summit. I've recently done, and I'm about to do another event with Gloria Steinem, which probably dates me. I'm a huge fan of Gloria Steinem. She was a leader of the women's movement. And so sometimes then, this is why. But maybe some of you are also kind of wondering why, too, there needs to be a specific focus on boys and men, why I've chosen this adventure. And you're right, leaving the Brookings Institution, where I was for 10 years, is difficult to do. Those of you who don't know the think tank world won't necessarily know that it's a nice, comfortable place to be. And so jumping out on my own in my mid-50s was not part of my life plan. But it did become my mission, and it has become my vocation. And so this is why I'm here. But why? But really, really why? Really, boys and men? Really? We need to focus on them as opposed to, say, some of the ongoing issues for women and girls? Why would I do that? Actually, why would I ignore the advice of so of my colleagues? And it's very difficult for me to believe this even now, a few years later, that I shouldn't even go near this subject. Every single one of my Brookings friends and colleagues said, if you write a book about boys and men, your reputation will not survive. And I couldn't get a publisher. I was rejected by every single mainstream publishing house. Not because they didn't think badly of me, but because the subject itself was too dangerous for them to touch. And here I am. The book is out. I've created a think tank. And Melinda French Gates it's not quite a grant of 20 million, unfortunately, or fortunately. I've become a grant maker. Melinda French Gates has asked 12 individuals each to spend $20 million in their field. And for me, that's boys and men. And so I've been invited by Melinda to invest $20 million in programs and initiatives working on behalf of boys and men. That was completely unexpected. I had nobody knew that was coming. And although I think that obviously it's incredibly important as a potential investment in such a young field in many ways, I think it may be even more important as a signal. John and Laura Arnold got it very early, as did some other philanthropists. But when Melinda French Gates gets the fact that, and I'll quote her directly, it is not good in the long run for women and girls if boys and men aren't flourishing too. That in the long run, we have to rise together. And one of the things I'm allowed to do is name my new fund, and I've decided to name it, this is not public yet, but I've decided to name my new fund Rise Together. Because I think that captures this spirit that a well-functioning and healthy society needs everyone to have opportunities to flourish. But there have been other books. I just want to be clear that I'm not first into this space by any means. Many people have paved the way. Hannah Rosen's book is 12 years old now. I have differences of opinion with all of these authors, by the way, but they've all been influential on me. Kay Heimovitz is more conservative. Philip Zimbardo is a psychologist. This is Andrew Yarrow, who wrote a book called Man Out for the Brookings Institution Press, which is where I ended up publishing too, just a few years earlier. This is a pretty well-known book by Warren Farrell and John Gray, The Boy Crisis, which goes through some of the same statistics, etc. And even since my book has come out, a more perhaps political book by Senator Josh Hawley, the junior senator from Missouri, Manhood, the Masculine Virtues America Needs. He and I have some disagreements on a couple of issues which we might get to. The point simply being that there's interest in this subject in different ways, but I don't think the debate is playing out in as positive and as healthy a way as possible for a few reasons. One I've already alluded to, that very often this is framed as zero-sum. And that somehow, if there are issues that boys and men are facing, which are real, that that's somehow because of the rise of women. That it's somehow because of the women's movement. And you'll get that a lot from people on the right, that it's part of a kind of general sense that things have gone, quotes, too far. Whereas in my view, things haven't gone far enough in the sense of creating opportunities for us both to flourish. But then from the left, the political left, you'll tend to get a message which is, are you kidding me? You're going to focus on boys and men. And almost at worst, the idea that a male struggle or that male suffering is close to an oxymoron in a patriarchy, right? And so both sides kind of leave this massive vacuum. Our failure to just honestly confront the real issues that many of our boys and men are facing and to address them responsibly based on the best evidence we have to hand. Our failure to do that has created a dangerous vacuum. A dangerous vacuum in our policymaking, in our research, and in our culture. And into that vacuum, I think we're losing very many of our men. And so that's why I decided to write my book and narrate it, having passed the audition to do so. Not only a book, but yes, I'm that guy that thinks what the world needs is more think tanks. You know what everyone out there in America is saying? We need more think tanks. That's the problem. We don't have enough think tanks. Well, here's a new one. I will defend this new think tank on the grounds that it is the first and only think tank focused on the specific issues of boys and men. And again, many people saying, really? Do we need that? I hope to persuade you in the next few minutes that we do need it and that it will be a positive contribution. And I think that the message from Melinda French Gates, that this is an area she wants to support, is a sign that many of our philanthropic leaders and increasingly, I hope, our political leaders are getting past the zero-sum nonsense about gender and saying, we can do two things at once. We can think two thoughts at once. We can say there are a lot of ways in which we need to pay more attention to what's happening to boys and men, and a lot of areas where we need to continue to do a huge amount more for women and girls. And anybody that tries to make us choose between those two is not our friend. Left or right, they're not our friend. They're not the friends of our families, our daughters, and our sons. I also have this theory that all scholarship is at least partly autobiographical. I've done a lot of work on social mobility before. That's because of my family background. But also, I'm a dad. Here are my boys. This was last year in North Wales. And this is from left to right. This is Cameron, George, and Bryce. I'm not in the picture because they're all taller than me, so why would I want to show you that? And behind them is Blaenau Ffestiniog, which is a slate mine where my family had been working for, last count, 8 generations. And so we went there in some sense for them to see part of their family. And so they're all in their 20s now. They're ranging between 22 and 28. They've been raised in both the UK and the US. And so I've had a sense of kind of what their journey's been like as well. And it's been different to my journey, for sure, in ways that I think are the result of largely hugely positive changes in society, but also have raised question marks for them about what does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be a good man? What is masculinity anyway? Should we be even talking about that, thinking about it, or abandoning it? There's question marks around their identity in a way that wasn't true for me and in ways that are both good and bad. And navigating that as a parent, I think, is challenging. I've just reviewed, and I highly recommend, a book by Ruth Whipman, a journalist. It's called Boy Mum. She also has 3 sons. And it's a very honest accounting of what it's like, particularly in her case as a very, very strong and lifelong feminist, to be raising 3 boys in today's environment. The other reason I got into this is because of a desire to be as truth-seeking as possible. This is a quote from C.P. Scott, who's the founder of the Manchester Guardian, the forerunner of The Guardian, where I spent a few years as a journalist. And comment is free is still the name of the op-ed page of The Guardian. And so people know that bit sometimes. Comment is free, but the second bit's the really important bit, is facts are sacred. And in general, in public policy and in public debate, it's hardly breaking news that people are choosing the facts that fit their theories, rather than adapting their theories to the facts as they find them. And that seems to be particularly true in this whole area when it comes to issues around sex and gender, because they're very personal and they're quite political. It seems to be particularly difficult for just straight facts to be discussed in a straightforward way. And that's one of the things that I try to do in my work. So I'm going to go through just a few areas here, and I hope that the spirit here is some of this won't be new to some of you, some of it will be, and I hope that it will provide material for those of you who are advocating on behalf of paying attention to some of these issues in the spirit that I've tried to outline here. So I'm going to cover 4 areas, some in a bit more detail than other, and then we're going to have some Q&A, which I enjoy the most when I give these presentations, because I always learn something new from you. So I'm just going to go through some of the key statistics, and you can find pretty much everything I'm about to say on the website of the Institute or in my other work. Mental health is obviously getting a lot of attention. It's not, I think, in this case, an exaggeration to use the word crisis. There are many symptoms of this crisis, especially among younger people, younger women and younger men. But I'm going to focus on perhaps the most tragic symptom of all, which is what happens to suicide rates. And I'm going to show you the suicide rates for women of these different age groups in 1999 and 2022. So you can see that over that just more than 2-decade period, we saw a rise in the suicide rates for all of these groups of women, including young women, middle-aged women, and older women. So, and from those numbers, that's quite a big increase. And these are the trends for men. And so you can see that there has been significant rise in all age groups for men too, from a much higher base. The rates are 4 times higher. We're losing 4 times as many men. In absolute numbers, it's about 40,000 men a year that we're losing now to loss of life, to suicide, which, just to put it in comparison, just in terms of the size of that, that's about the same as the number of deaths from breast cancer each year. Obviously, they're very different problems. I'm not equating them in a policy sense or a normative sense. I'm just giving you a sense of the scale here. And it's risen very quickly. And if you go to the work we've done on suicide, we can show that actually since 2010, all of the rise in suicide has been among young men. Since 2010, the loss of life to suicide has risen by a third among men aged between 15 and 29. So that is a crisis. We've also done some recent work where we're just looking at what happens to loss of life from different causes. This is a very interesting data set that we've just started analyzing, and this shows you years of potential life lost. It's a very, very wonky way to look at a very personal issue, which is if people are dying from certain causes under the age of 65, how many years of life has been lost? So the younger they die, the more years of potential life is lost. That's the measure. And so try and get a sense of the difference we feel intuitively between someone dying at the age of 5 and someone dying at the age of 65. Just the years that have been lost. And what you can see here is that the so-called deaths of despair, drug poisoning, this is women now. So this is last year's data. We lost just short of 1.5 million years of female lives to these different causes as broken down. Drug poisoning, suicide, motor vehicle homicide, and then all the others. These are from injury deaths, so this does not include cancer, cardiovascular, etc. And then this is for men. So we use just over 4 million years of life, potential life for men. And in particular, you can see that drug poisoning is now number 1, followed by suicide. That's overtaken motor vehicles, so we're losing fewer years of life now to motor vehicles, largely because cars have become significantly safer. But the suicide rate, as I just showed, has gone up, and the drug poisoning rate has gone up very significantly as well. And you can see that actually drug poisoning alone, loss of life to drugs, this is not separately classified from suicide, but just an overdose that's not classified as suicide. We actually lose more years of male life to that one cause alone in this category than to the total number of female lives lost. So those skew very male, and as a public policy person, you need to know that. Now I'm going to talk a bit about education, which is obviously very close to home for you, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this one than I am going to on the other 3. Some of this, again, you might have seen some headlines for, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. In 1971-72, that academic year, most degrees went to men. So only 44% of bachelor's degrees now, this is 4-year degrees, went to women. And so that 13 points there is the gender gap in favor of men. In 1971-72, those who know your history will know that's when Title IX was passed to really try and encourage more gender equality in higher education, especially. And there was a really rapid change. We saw a very, very quick catch-up. The gender gap largely closing by the mid-80s. Then the gender gap widened again, but the other way. And now it's wider still. There's now a 16 percentage point gap in the acquisition of college degrees in favor of women. So there's a slightly bigger gender gap today in 4-year college degrees than there was in 1972 when we passed Title IX, but it's reversed. I'm not also going to suggest that it's for the same reasons. You can have same numbers and same trends, but for very different reasons. So it's important to note here that there was a real problem with exclusion of women from institutions, sometimes legally and very often just in terms of social norms. That is not the problem facing men. There are different causes of the gap, but the gap is huge and growing. Since 1910, I just lost a century. Since 2010, we've seen a drop of 1.2 million in college enrollment. These are numbers that many of you will know. 1 million of that drop, so of that 1.2 million drop, 1 million has been among men. So almost all of the drop in college enrollment over the last 14 years has been among men. I do want to make this point a couple of times in my talk. It's a huge issue for us at the Institute, which is to get at the intersection of race and gender. So I'm just going to show you at these different levels, there's 4 different levels of degree here, what share of the degree is going to, I'm just doing black and white here, black students are going to black women versus black men, and then you can see associates at the top, and then for white students, and then the same all the way down. And so the message here is there is a gender gap in college degree acquisition for both white and black students, but it's much wider for black students. There are twice as many black women getting a college degree as black men. Now, we're heading that way on current trends overall. but it's already there for black students, and HBCUs in particular are in many ways at the very sharp edge of this debate because they are already very, very female skewed and struggling to attract and retain and graduate black men. Now, why would you see such a big gap in college? Well, it's partly, of course, because of what happens in high school. It's largely predicted by that. So here's high school GPA at the bottom. What I'm going to show you here is these are the poorest performing high school students. I should say the lowest performing high school students by GPA. This is the bottom 10% of graduating high school students by their GPA. And you can see that it's almost two-thirds male. So right at the bottom of the distribution, two-thirds male. Here's the rest of the distribution. At the top of the distribution, the top 10%, it's two-thirds female. So if you are a selective higher education institution and you're typically taking your students from towards the top of this distribution, you're already looking at an applicant pool that is very female skewed, even out of high school. The only area in which there is not a significant gender gap in college admissions is in SATs and ACTs. Standardized tests, there isn't really a gender gap. Everything else is a big gender gap. And so the main effect of an institution going test optional is to significantly increase the skew towards female students by about 4 percentage points, according to a Vanderbilt study, which is mechanically obvious if you take out the one area where male students are actually performing at about equal levels, which is SATs and ACTs. You take that out of the equation, all of the other areas where the girls are way ahead of the boys carry more weight. So that's the main effect of going test optional. It doesn't really have much effect on anything else, but it does affect your gender composition quite a bit, which again is not to say you shouldn't do it. It is to say you should do it with your eyes open. If you take tests out, you will skew significantly more in a female direction. And if that matters to you, which it may not, and that's an argument we can have, then you should be aware of that. Now, why would you see GPA being so different when SAT and ACT standardized tests are not? Largely because I believe, largely because of the developmental gap we see, particularly in adolescence, between girls and boys, which we couldn't see before because girls' and women's educational opportunities were so truncated, were so restricted by sexist rules and sexist assumptions that girls' natural advantage in the classroom was being suppressed. But now that we have very largely done away with that, it's showing up. So it's being revealed. And here's the evidence for that. I'm going to show you here a chart which shows you a couple of things. This is girls age 10 from the left up to the mid-20s here. And this first chart is showing you, on average, impulse control. And this is showing you sensation seeking. Developmental psychologists refer to these sometimes as like the gas and the brake in a car, right? Sensation seeking, the orange line, is the gas. Sensation seeking is, that looks like fun, let's do that, let's stay out late, yes, I will try that drink, screw the biology test tomorrow, etc., right? Everything's a great idea, right? And impulse control is the brake in the car saying, maybe you should go home early because you've got that test tomorrow. Maybe you shouldn't try that drink. Maybe you shouldn't take that jump. Maybe you shouldn't try that drug. Maybe you shouldn't, etc., right? And as you can see, this is just girls again. You can see that like sensation-seeking peaks in those adolescent years, right? That's when you kind of want to go for it, and the world is new and exciting. It's one of the things that makes adolescence so great. And you can also see that impulse control is not quite developed yet, so the gas is a bit more gas than brake, but then the impulse control develops, you start to make better decisions, you think about the implications for tomorrow, etc. Now, to be clear, it's not that one is good or bad, it's that you want to make sure that you've got a bit of both, right? In the same way that a car wouldn't work very well with gas with only one of them. Life would be really dull if we were all impulse control. We'd never do anything, right? Because it'd be so boring. But if we didn't have some impulse control, we're all sensation seeking, we would just eat everything, do everything, risk everything every single minute of the day. We wouldn't last very long, and we certainly wouldn't have a very successful career. So you need both. So this is what, and you can see that that period of adolescence is a bit difficult, right? It's one of the reasons why adolescence is hard. It also matters for educational outcomes because, after all, you're 16, it's 10 p.m., your friend texts you, want to go out, we're getting together to go out, and you've got to study for a test. What do you do? Go out. Yes, well, it's a male audience. I'll show you the chart. Correct. You go out if you're male. So this shows you exactly the same chart for men. Sensation-seeking, impulse control. You can see that there's a similar shape, that is this period in adolescence where you, in fact, yes, go out rather than staying home and studying for your chemistry test. The gap's bigger for boys. And that has all kinds of implications, not least of which we kind of just, teen boys are twice as likely to die as teen girls. And some of it is about that. It is about that risk-taking, go for it, sensation-seeking, and the break, the impulse control is not there. I try not to get the audience to focus too much on the right-hand side of the chart because that sort of suggests that we never grow up. But you can see that it gets a lot better as we grow up. But this critical period here is the high school years. And so I believe that one of the reasons in high school in particular the GPA difference is so big by gender is because, and I'd like to congratulate the gentleman for his honesty, the guy is just much more likely when he gets the text from a friend at 10 p.m. saying, hey, let's go out, to say, sure, what could go wrong? Whereas the girl, on average, is a bit more likely to say, yeah, I've got a chemistry test tomorrow, maybe not. Again, on average, right? And all teenagers struggle with this. It's just that boys seem to struggle a little bit more to just stick to the task even when they really, 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 really don't want to. So these are sometimes called non-cognitive skills or soft skills. I like to think of them as completing your chemistry homework skills. I don't know why I pick on chemistry. Are there any chemistry professors in the room or chemistry majors in the room? Anybody doing chemistry? I apologize. But it's like, and I've raised 3 boys, so I have some sense of what this is like. Turning in your chemistry homework sounds like an easy thing, right? It's actually incredibly difficult. I think I've got to 7 stages now to turn in your chemistry homework. You have to be in class when it's assigned. You have to be paying attention in class when it's assigned. You have to make a note of it. Make a note so that you'll remember later that it's been assigned. You have to remember later that you're supposed to do it. Having remembered later you're supposed to do it, you have to do it when you don't want to do it because it's chemistry homework. And then, this is 6, most fatally and most importantly, you have to turn it in. And there's good evidence that that's where a lot of students, especially male students, even when they do, maybe it's an N of 2 with my kids, but I'm like, so you did your homework, did you turn it in? No, I forgot to turn it in. Maybe that's why your GP, anyway, difference. The other thing that's happening in our schools in K-12, and this is a huge issue for the American Institute for Boys and Men, and maybe for Rise Together as well, is going to be the cratering share of men in our teaching profession. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan came to office, it was 1 in 3. 33% of K-12 teachers were men. Now it's 23% and falling. And every year, the number goes down. And every year, no one pays it any attention. If nothing else changes as a result of my work, that will change. I want governors and school districts and departments to take seriously the idea that representation matters. And the representation of male teachers matters. My own son, thank you, my own son, who struggled so much through high school, only just graduated, to be honest, didn't go to school for 3 weeks. We found out later that his email account my wife's email account had been hacked by his younger brother, so we weren't getting the emails, which is brilliant, really. And very teamworky, very fraternal, if I can use that. So simultaneously really proud, but kind of, Anyway, I hadn't gone to school for 3 weeks, right? It was a 1-student chronic absenteeism crisis. He bumped through. Just this month has started work through a teacher residency program as a public school teacher in Baltimore City Public Schools. My son, right? I'm incredibly proud of it, right? So the family joke is, oh, so now you're going to go to school? I said, you do know you need to go every day if you're the teacher. It's funny how things come around, and one of the reasons he's doing it is because he struggled so much that he wants to help, especially boys, to have a less difficult time of it in schools. It's especially true at these younger ages. There are basically no men in pre-K. If I cut this by race as well, obviously you can imagine what happens at pre-K. Elementary school, it's fewer than 1 in 10 now. This is the share of men in the dark green. Middle school, it's 1 in 4. High school, it's 44% and falling. And then in post-secondary, in colleges, it's 50-50. And so you can see that the kind of the story you get about education and gender is very different for boys than it is for girls as they kind of go through this system. And so at the very least, I think we could do something about that. And here I think this is the only other time I'm going to do race, but we did some work. We're the first ones to do this. And again, it's not hard to do, but we're the only ones that did it, where we looked at the ratio of teachers to students based on both gender and race. So it had been done by race before, but not by gender and race. And so what you can see is that for every white female student, there's one white female teacher. White women dominate the K-12 education system. And so there's a 5-to-1 ratio of white girls to white female teachers. Right? For other girls, not so good. Because it's dominated by white women, you can see that it's 10-to-1 for black, 11-to-1 for Asian, 16-to-1 for Hispanic, in terms of that representation by both race and gender. Okay. For white boys, it's 17-to-1, so similar to Hispanic girls, a little bit worse. And this is the other. Black, Hispanic, and by the time you get to Hispanic, it's 57-to-1. And so again, if you think about this through the intersectional lens of race and gender, what you can see is, because it skews so female, if you then add race to it, the chances, if you're a black student or a Hispanic student or an even Asian student, of seeing a teacher that is the same race and gender as you is very, very low if you're a boy. All right? I think that's a problem if we think representation matters. I'm now going to say a bit about the labor market and employment. Obviously, some of those trends we've seen in education will play up in the labor market. And I want to be clear here that there's still a gender pay gap, which is now pretty largely proven to be the result of the very, very different distribution of labor around child rearing. It's still very gendered. You're still seeing women's careers being hit much harder by childcare. Now, we can get into a whole debate about what you do about that, how far that's choice, etc. But it is still true that there is a significant gender gap. It just narrowed post-COVID, which is good news, but it is significant nonetheless, about 84 cents in the dollar, women to men. But as I say, it's mostly about family and care, which is where the policy debate needs to move if we're to do anything about it. But I just want to show you some trends, because the other thing I want to intersect hereby is by class. One of the big problems of this debate is that if you spend all your time with upper middle class people, you don't see a lot of these gender gaps, because they're not as high at the top of the distribution. So this shows you in dark green for the men and light green for the women, these different points in the distribution, what's happened to wages since 1979. And you can see the 20th percentile, that's 20% of the way up the distribution, so low income. That's about the poverty line. So folks at the poverty line, then the middle, and then the 80th percentile. That's people well into six figures in the distribution. And so what you can see is that wages for women have grown at all of those points, but much more at the top. Wages for men have only grown at the top. Then add in the fact that those men and those women are very often forming households together, and you get the whole explanation for economic inequality, basically. You add wages and family formation together, that's economic inequality in one chart. But most men are earning less than most men were in 1979. Most men who enter the labor market today will earn less than their fathers did. Not men at the top, but most men. That's not nothing. That's not nothing economically, and it's certainly not nothing culturally. The expectation that you will do better than your parents economically is very strong and not crazy given economic growth. So to do worse, to be poorer, is hard. And that's affecting most men. And another way to think about that is how the male and female wage distribution have changed. So don't worry too much about exactly what's being shown here. It's just a distribution showing you that the male wage distribution, which is the dark green again, and the female, they looked very different in 1979. What this is basically showing you is that women's wages are skewed to the left, men's a bit more to the right. Men earn a lot more than women. And in that moment in time, in 1979, only 13% of women earned more than the median man in the middle. Fast forward to 2019, the distributions look pretty different. They look different in two ways. One, they're skewed much more to the right because people at the top of the distribution have seen much bigger wage gains. But you can also see that the female wage distribution has not caught up with, but is much closer than it was in 1979, such that now 40% of women earn more than the median man. This is great news. This is amazing news. The growing economic power of women has been the biggest economic liberation in human history. And there's still more to do. Fantastic news. But it does raise questions as to what the economic relationship between men and women going forward will be. Having achieved much greater gender equality economically, what it means to be a father, what it means to be a husband is very different for my generation than it was for my father's generation. And it's very different for my son's generation, even from mine. And we just have to be honest about that. And have that conversation without fearing that anybody wants to go back. That anybody in this debate thinks the solution to men's problems is to somehow go back. And this is so much of the problem with the current debate. When you talk about people on the kind of more reactionary right talk about this, men are struggling, we need to turn back the clock on women. And then on the left, you get, look at all the stuff women have got to deal with. We're not going to talk about men, so they turn their back on men. We can think two thoughts at once. It's not a zero-sum game. But it is crazy and naive to think that such a profound transformation in the relationship between men and women economically doesn't raise questions about the role of men. And we should have a responsible conversation about that. Us, not them, not everybody else. Oh, there is one more race one here, just showing you that white men have seen an increase in their wages. White women, this is median now, white women have seen a huge increase in their wages. Black men barely moved. White women have hugely overtaken black men now. White women earn much more than black men. Black women have come up, but they haven't quite caught up with black men, but they probably will quite soon. So it's about black women earn about 94 cents on the dollar for black men. The trend lines are going up. So you can see that it's very important when we talk about gender gaps and race gaps to try and do it both together, because then you'll see very different patterns emerging for different groups. And you can see white women have just seen an extraordinary rise in their earnings. They have not caught up with white men, but you can see what great progress they've made, much faster growth than black women, and much faster growth than black men, much, much faster. In 1979, there wasn't much of a difference in wages between white women and black women. Now there's a huge one. And the last thing on employment is just something I've already alluded to around education, but it's not just education where we're seeing a cratering share of men. And anyone who works in this space, I really implore you to think hard about this challenge. This shows you the share of men in 1980 up to 2020 in each of these professions: psychology, K8, which I've already mentioned, social work, and nursing. And what you can see is a cratering share of men in all those professions except nursing, which has come up a little bit. But the mental health professions, remember the charts about mental health, the mental health professions have become female professions. They weren't, they are now. So if anybody who says, as is one of my disagreements with Senator Hawley, anybody who says, well, they're just not jobs for men, my answer is, well, how come they were in the 1980s? Did men change that fast? Evolution doesn't work that quickly, Senator. So something's changed about those professions. Nursing's gone up. Not for nothing, nursing is the only one of these professions to have seen a significant pay rise. Economics really matters here. But I do not think it is good news that we have seen our mental health professions skew so strongly in one direction. Again, not really being mentioned, not really being worked on. The professional associations aren't working on it. And I will say that I think it would be if it was the other way around. And it should be if it was the other way around, but it should be this way around too. When I needed mental health care, when one of my sons needed mental health care, really glad to be able to find, in that case, a male carer. Just as I think a woman would want to have that choice too. But it's getting harder and harder and harder. And I was in a men's college not that long ago, and I think most, if not all, of the counseling staff are women. And that's not for want of trying. It's for want of there not being enough men in those professions. And so we should have real efforts there, and I have some ideas on that in a moment. And then I've alluded to family already, but I'll just do one thing on this, which is to show partly as a result of the economic rise of women, which, just to underline, is a fabulous thing, we have seen a change in the role of family life. This shows you the share of children born outside marriage to women of different educational attainments. We do this on women because the data's cleaner. You can see in 1990, only 5% of children born to women with a 4-year degree, only 5% were born outside marriage. Now it's 11%. Just doubled. That's not where the action is, though. The action is in the other education categories. especially those with some college or an associate's degree, high school degree, where it's more than doubled, but from a much higher base, 25% to 52%. So it is now the case that outside of the 4-year college-educated class, most kids are born outside marriage. Most. And so the idea that we can assume that marriage is the default institution within which our children are being raised is absolutely true for the vast majority of people with 4-year college degrees. But it is absolutely untrue for everybody else. And that has profound implications for the way we think about fatherhood policy, child welfare policy, paid leave, etc. Now, one of the other things I try to do with this work is to have some solutions. And so this is my I'm in the final lab. And I hope I've left a bit of time. I have. Some solutions. Start boys in school a year later. They, on average, develop a year later, and there's nothing wrong with them. I'm not blaming the boys, it's just true. And I showed you the charts for that. So why don't we just do it? A lot of rich people do it already. Private schools do it almost by default. Why shouldn't all kids get that benefit? Boys need another year. 14-year-old boy is not the same age as a 14-year-old girl. Chronologically, yes. Developmentally, no. As Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said, at the age of 15, they don't just look like different sexes, they look like different species. I'm a father. Got to tell you, it doesn't sound totally wrong. Could we please have more technical high schools? Those are educational interventions that seem to work especially for boys. They seem to be neutral for girls. Of course, girls should go. Incredibly strong evidence. The decline of CTE generally has been bad, period, but it's been especially bad for our boys and especially bad for our men. More apprenticeship, same thing. We've just got to have different forms of hands-on learning. I hope I've made this case. Could we get back to Reagan era share of male teachers? Is that such a preposterously crazy idea? 1 in 3 as a target? You know, I've done my bit. One of my sons is a teacher. What are you doing about it? Every college campus should have a men's resource center. Every single one. Offering counseling, advice to the men on those campuses. The single biggest risk factor for dropping out of college now is being male. Attracting and retaining men on the campuses, that's a huge crisis. Do not get rid of the women's resource centers, which some are now doing under pressure, political pressure. Do not get rid of that. We still need women's resource centers. But add men's resource centers. Every college should have one. I want to give financial scholarships to get men into those jobs, mental health professions, education. Scholarships just for men to get into those professions. One fraternity is offering scholarships to their fraternity members who go into teaching. That's a great start. I want to see that scaled up. Money matters. I do not want to get rid of some of the scholarships to get women into STEM, which have been so successful. Don't abolish them, but add these. Why don't we have these? And we should have equal paid leave for fathers. Fathers should have specific leave so that they can have time with their kids as well. If we're going to have paid leave, it has to be on an equal basis so that we don't inadvertently send the message through policy that parenting is women's work, because it is not women's work. I was at home with my kids for a while. Raising my kids, being a father, has been hugely important to me, and I would like public policy in every single way and in every single utterance to underline the message that dads matter as much as mums, not more than, not less than, but as much as mums. And God bless the dads who are raising their own kids and other kids too. So let's embed that in public policy and make that part of the positive message about masculinity. Greg wrote a lovely piece, I hope you don't mind me calling you out, a lovely piece about your own motto, growth through sacrifice. I hate the term toxic masculinity. I think it's toxic. I think what we're really talking about is the difference between immature masculinity and mature masculinity. What does it mean to mature? And I think it is about, quoting Greg, growth through sacrifice. A mature man is a man who gives more than he gets. A mature man is one who lives for others, not for himself. There is this online movement of young men, which some of you may know, black pill movement, men going their own way, etc. Let me tell you this. Men who go their own way, who live only for themselves, are not men. That's not what makes you a man. If you're going your own way and you're only for yourself, that's not masculinity. Every known human society has relied on men who give more than they get, who provide, not just money, especially given the trends I've shown you, but who generate. generative, positive masculinity. We need it today. We just need it in a new way for this wonderful world we're creating where our daughters have the same opportunities as our sons. Thank you for your attention.